Well, 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 my little prophets of doom, welcome back to the delicious madness that is reality unfolding exactly as you predicted. January feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? But time is such a funny thing. It crawls when you're waiting for chaos to bloom, and then suddenly it sprints when the dominoes start falling. You know what's beautiful about your predictions? They're not really predictions at all. They're just observations. Observations of patterns that most people are too comfortable, too safe, too sane to notice. But not you. Oh no, not you. You see the cracks before they become chasms. You smell the smoke before the fire consumes everything. Back in January, when the world was still drunk on New Year's optimism and fresh starts, you sat there, didn't you? You looked at the chessboard, and while everyone else was distracted by the shiny pieces, you saw the inevitable checkmate coming. The moves were already made. The trap was already set. All you had to do was wait. And what did they call you? Crazy, conspiracy theorist, doomsday predictor. But here's the beautiful thing about being called crazy. Sometimes crazy is just early. Sometimes crazy is just clear-sighted in a world full of people who choose blindness because the truth is too uncomfortable to swallow. Think about it. When you watch a building burn, do you blame the match? Or do you blame the person who soaked the foundation in gasoline months before? Because that's what you witnessed in January. Not the lighting of the match, but the methodical, systematic soaking of everything that was about to burn. The signs were everywhere. The overconfidence masquerading as strength. The desperate attempts to control narratives that were already spiraling beyond control. The way they doubled down on strategies that were, well, let's just say they were building their house of cards in a hurricane zone. But here's what fascinates me most. It's not that they ignored the warning signs. It's that they couldn't see them. They were so intoxicated by their own perceived power, so drunk on their own mythology, that they mistook the calm before the storm for permanent sunshine. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were immortal. Remember when you were telling anyone who would listen about the concept of inevitable collapse? Not because you're some mystical fortune teller, but because collapse follows patterns, always. It's like watching a crack in a dam. You don't need supernatural powers to know that water will eventually find its way through. You just need to pay attention. And you did pay attention, didn't you? While they were busy playing their games, you were watching the foundations crumble. While they were celebrating their apparent victories, you were counting the cost of their hubris. While they were planning their next moves, you were already 3 steps ahead, seeing where those moves would inevitably lead them. The beauty of your prediction isn't in being right. It's in understanding that chaos isn't random. It's not some cosmic accident. Chaos is just order that hasn't revealed its pattern yet. And once you can see the pattern, once you can read the writing on the wall, prediction becomes as simple as watching dominoes fall. So here we are in June, the middle of the year, the middle of their unraveling, and everything is happening exactly as you said it would. Not because you're a prophet, but because you understood something they didn't. You understood that actions have consequences, that lies have expiration dates, that empires built on quicksand don't just fall, they get swallowed whole. The downward spiral you predicted, it's not just happening, it's accelerating. Each day brings new confirmation of what you saw coming from miles away. Each headline reads like a page from the script you wrote in January. Each development feels like watching a movie you've already seen, except this time, you get to enjoy the dramatic irony of knowing how it ends. But let's be honest about something. This isn't about you being right. This isn't about intellectual superiority or some twisted form of satisfaction. This is about understanding. Understanding that the world operates on principles that don't care about anyone's comfort level. Principles that don't bend to wishful thinking or desperate denial. What you're witnessing isn't just a downfall. It's a masterclass in inevitability. A demonstration of what happens when reality finally catches up with delusion. When the bills come due. When the house of cards meets the slightest breath of honest wind. They thought they could manipulate the game indefinitely. They thought they could change the rules mid-play. They thought that confidence alone could overcome, well, everything. But reality has this annoying habit of not caring what anyone thinks. Reality just is. And reality was always going to catch up with them. The only question was when. The only variable was how spectacular the collapse would be. And from where. You're sitting now, looking back at your January predictions, looking forward at what June still has to reveal. Spectacular doesn't even begin to cover it. The spiral isn't just beginning. It's gaining momentum. Each turn downward creates velocity for the next turn. Each mistake compounds the previous ones. Each desperate attempt to regain control only tightens the noose they've been weaving for themselves all along. You saw this coming because you understood something fundamental about the nature of, let's call it justice. Not the kind you find in courtrooms, but the kind that operates on a cosmic level. The kind that ensures that what goes up must come down. That every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. That pride always comes before the fall. But understanding the pattern was just the beginning for you. Watching it unfold exactly as you predicted, that's where things get really interesting. Because now you're not just an observer, you're a witness to something beautiful in its terrifying inevitability. And what a witness you are. You didn't just predict their downfall, you predicted the exact flavor of it, the precise texture of their desperation, the specific brand of chaos they would unleash upon themselves. Because that's what separates true vision from lucky guessing. Details. Beautiful, terrifying details. Remember when you called it in January? Not just that they would fall, but how they would fall. You saw the panic coming before they even knew they had reasons to panic. You predicted the scrambling, the finger-pointing, the desperate attempts to rewrite history while history was still being written. You saw them turning on each other before they even realized they were sinking. And now look at them. June has arrived like a debt collector, and they're frantically searching through their pockets for currency they never bothered to earn. The spiral you predicted isn't just happening. It's happening with such precision, such exquisite timing, such perfect mathematical certainty that it almost feels choreographed. But here's what makes your prediction truly artistic. You didn't just see the fall. You saw the psychology behind it. You understood that their greatest strength would become their greatest weakness, that their confidence would curdle into arrogance, that their control would twist into desperation, that their unity would fragment into, well, let's just say the family dinner has become quite uncomfortable. You knew they would double down when they should have backed down. You knew they would attack when they should have retreated. You knew they would lie when the truth was their only salvation, because you understood something about human nature that they were too human to understand about themselves. The beautiful irony is that they had every opportunity to prove you wrong, every chance to change course, every moment to step back from the precipice and say, you know what? Maybe this isn't the hill we want to die on. Maybe this isn't the battle worth losing everything for. Maybe, just maybe, there's wisdom in strategic retreat. But no, they chose the path you predicted they would choose. Every single time. Like actors following a script they didn't know they were given. Like players in a game where only you knew the rules. Like moths to a flame, except you predicted exactly which flame would prove irresistible. And the timing? Oh, the timing is just perfect. June isn't just the middle of the year, it's the middle of their unraveling. The perfect vantage point to look back at your January warnings and forward at the inevitable conclusion. 6 months of watching your predictions unfold like a slow-motion car crash where every frame proves you right. You called the overreach. You called the backlash. You called the internal fractures. You called the external pressures. You called the moment when their supporters would start asking uncomfortable questions. You called the moment when their enemies would stop needing to attack because they were destroying themselves more efficiently than any opposition ever could. But perhaps your most brilliant prediction was about the speed, not the fact of their downfall, but the acceleration of it. How each mistake would compound the next. How each desperate move would create 2 new problems. How each attempt to control the narrative would only feed the chaos they were trying to contain. You saw the avalanche coming when it was still just a few pebbles rolling downhill. You understood that momentum is a cruel master, that once certain forces are set in motion, they develop their own gravity, their own unstoppable logic, their own hunger for completion. The questions they're asking now, you predicted those too. The desperate searches for scapegoats, the frantic attempts to find someone, anyone, to blame for decisions they made willingly. The revisionist history that tries to paint their choices as somehow inevitable rather than idiotic. You knew they would claim they were misunderstood. You knew they would insist their intentions were pure. You knew they would argue that context matters while simultaneously ignoring every piece of context that contradicted their narrative. You knew they would play victim while standing in the wreckage of their own making. And the silence. Oh, you predicted the silence too, the strategic withdrawals, the sudden unavailability, the mysterious inability to comment on rapidly developing situations, the way they would vanish from public view just when their voices were most needed, to explain the inexplicable. But silence, as you knew it would, only amplifies the chaos, creates more questions than it answers, feeds speculation that grows wilder and more damaging than any truth they were trying to hide. Silence becomes its own form of confession in situations like these. You understood that in the modern world, perception moves faster than reality, that narrative velocity can exceed the speed of truth. That once a story starts spiraling in a certain direction, it develops its own momentum that becomes almost impossible to stop or redirect. The predictions you made weren't just about their actions. They were about reactions, about consequences, about the ripple effects that would spread outward from each poor decision like circles in a disturbed pond. Except these circles never stopped expanding, never lost their energy, never faded into calm water. You predicted the domino effect before the first domino was even properly positioned. You saw the chain reaction while they were still arranging the pieces. You understood that in complex systems, small changes can produce catastrophic results, that tiny miscalculations can compound into civilization-ending errors. The media response. You called that too, didn't you? how they would initially try to spin it, how the spin would become increasingly desperate, how the narrative would shift from confident assertions to damage control to outright panic, how journalists who once carried their water would suddenly develop selective amnesia about their previous coverage. You predicted the public relations disasters before they even hired their public relations teams. You saw through their carefully crafted messages to the rot underneath. You knew that polished presentations couldn't hide fundamental flaws, that makeup can't cover gangrene. And the financial implications, you saw those coming too. How market confidence would erode, how investors would start asking harder questions, how the numbers they'd been touting would suddenly look less impressive under scrutiny, how accounting practices that seemed clever in January would appear criminal by June. You understood that credibility is like a bank account. You can make withdrawals for a while, but eventually you run out of credit. Eventually, people stop believing your promises because your promises have consistently failed to materialize. Eventually, your word becomes worthless currency in a marketplace that demands results. The personal costs, you predicted those as well. How the stress would show on their faces, how the pressure would affect their relationships, how the constant firefighting would exhaust them, how the people closest to them would start distancing themselves from the chaos. You knew that power built on shaky foundations attracts the wrong kind of people. That when the structure starts collapsing, the rats are the first to abandon ship. That loyalty purchased with favors evaporates the moment those favors stop flowing. And now, as June unfolds exactly as you said it would, there's something almost poetic about it. The precision of your foresight, the mathematical certainty of consequences, the way reality has organized itself around the predictions you made when most people thought you were just, what did they call you again? Pessimistic? Paranoid? Negative? Funny how negativity looks like wisdom when the smoke clears. How paranoia resembles preparation when the danger proves real. How pessimism becomes prophecy when the worst-case scenarios start playing out exactly as predicted. You didn't just predict their downfall. You predicted the flavor of their panic, the texture of their desperation, the specific ways they would sabotage themselves when faced with choices between admitting error and doubling down on disaster. You knew they would choose disaster every time, because that's what people do when they're trapped between their ego and reality. They choose ego, even when ego demands they walk straight off a cliff, even when ego requires them to burn down everything they claim to care about, even when ego becomes the very force that destroys everything they were supposedly trying to protect. The cascade effect you predicted is now in full swing. Each revelation creates 3 new questions. Each answer raises 5 new doubts. Each attempt at explanation only highlights how deep the problems really go. The web of complications you saw coming has become a labyrinth with no exit. And as June continues to unfold, as your predictions continue their relentless march toward complete vindication, there's really only one question left. Not whether you were right. That question answered itself months ago. The question now is, what else did you see coming that the rest of us are still blind to? Because that's the thing about true prophecy, isn't it? It doesn't stop with one prediction. Vision. Vision is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. The more patterns you recognize, the deeper you can see into the maze of cause and effect that most people mistake for randomness. So what else did you see? What other dominoes did you identify while everyone else was still arguing about whether the first one would actually fall. Because looking at your January predictions now, it's clear you weren't just making isolated observations. You were reading from a much larger script, a script that's still unfolding. You saw the secondary collapses coming, didn't you? The way their fall would create vacuums that other players would rush to fill, how their weakness would embolden their competitors, how their mistakes would become case studies for everyone else on exactly what not to do. The political ramifications you predicted are materializing beautifully. The way their stumbles would shift entire power dynamics, how their credibility crisis would spread like a contagion to everyone associated with them, how guilt by association would become the new normal in their circles. You knew the investigations would multiply, that each inquiry would uncover 3 new areas requiring investigation, that transparency, once demanded, would reveal things they never intended to be transparent about, that the cover-up would become more damaging than the original crime, and the timing of these revelations. You called that too. How they would be strategically leaked, how each piece of damaging information would be released at the precise moment when it would cause maximum damage, how their enemies would have learned patience from watching their January arrogance. The cultural shift you predicted is perhaps the most fascinating. How public opinion wouldn't just turn against them, but would turn so completely that supporting them would become socially toxic. How their brand would transform from asset to liability overnight. How their name would become synonymous with failure. You understood that in the modern world, reputation is everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything because it determines your access to power, resources, influence. Nothing because it can evaporate instantly based on a single poorly timed revelation or a viral moment of truth. The technology angle, you saw that coming too. How their digital footprints would become archaeological evidence, how deleted posts would be recovered, how private communications would become public spectacle, how the internet never forgets, especially when forgetting would be convenient. You predicted how social media would amplify their downfall, how algorithms designed to maximize engagement would prioritize their most embarrassing moments, how the platforms they once used to control their narrative would become the vehicles of their destruction. The generational divide you foresaw is playing out exactly as predicted. How younger audiences would reject them entirely, while older supporters would cling desperately to outdated loyalties. How this divide would create fractures within their own base that they couldn't paper over with empty promises. You knew the international implications would be significant. How their domestic failures would affect their global standing. How allies would distance themselves. How adversaries would capitalize on the chaos. How their weakness would shift geopolitical balances in ways they never anticipated. The economic consequences you predicted are rippling outward, like shockwaves from an explosion, market confidence eroding, investment patterns shifting, economic relationships being reevaluated based on new risk assessments, their financial empire built on perception crumbling as perception turned hostile. But perhaps your most prescient prediction was about the speed of modern consequences, how in the digital age, downfalls happen faster than ever before, how 24-hour news cycles compress time frames, how what used to take years now happens in months, weeks, sometimes days. You understood that modern scandals have their own physics, their own laws of momentum and acceleration, their own gravitational pull that draws in peripheral players and peripheral consequences go until the original incident becomes the center of a much larger catastrophe. The psychological profile you developed of their behavior under pressure, spot on. How they would lash out at allies, how they would make increasingly desperate moves, how they would sacrifice long-term relationships for short-term damage control, how they would choose spite over strategy when backed into corners. You predicted their attempts at reinvention, how they would try to rebrand themselves as victims, how they would attempt to shift focus to their accusers rather than their actions, how they would deploy every classic deflection technique in the playbook, not realizing that everyone had already read that playbook. The institutional responses you foresaw are materializing perfectly. How organizations would scramble to distance themselves. How boards would suddenly discover the courage to ask hard questions. How institutional memory would be selectively refreshed to exclude uncomfortable associations. You saw the documentary crews coming, the book deals, the tell-all interviews, how their downfall would become content for others to monetize, how their failure would fuel entire media ecosystems dedicated to analyzing every aspect of their collapse. The historical parallels you drew in January are proving remarkably accurate. How their story would echo other spectacular failures. How the patterns of hubris and downfall would repeat with modern variations. How history wouldn't repeat, but it would certainly rhyme. You predicted the moment when their supporters would stop defending them and start defending themselves from association with them, when loyalty would transform into liability, when standing by them would become more dangerous than abandoning them. The legal implications you foresaw are cascading beautifully. How civil issues would become criminal investigations. How regulatory oversights would become enforcement actions. How what seemed like minor infractions would reveal major violations once properly examined. You understood that in complex systems, failure rarely happens in isolation. That pulling one thread unravels entire tapestries. That investigating one question leads to 12 new questions, each more damaging than the last. The existential questions you raised in January are now unavoidable. Questions about accountability in positions of power. Questions about the systems that enabled their rise. Questions about how similar failures can be prevented in the future. But here's what makes your predictions truly remarkable. You didn't just see their downfall. You saw the space their downfall would create, the opportunities it would generate, the power vacuums it would leave behind, the new players who would emerge to fill those voids. You understood that destruction and creation are part of the same process, that every ending enables new beginnings, that their failure would become someone else's opportunity, that their mistakes would become everyone else's education. So as we sit here in June, watching your January predictions play out with clockwork precision, the question isn't whether you were right. The question is, what comes next? What did? You see beyond their downfall? What rises from the ashes of their spectacular failure? Because true vision doesn't stop at predicting collapse. True vision sees what gets built on the rubble. And something tells me you saw that coming too. The game isn't over. It's just changing players. And you knew that all along, didn't you? Welcome to the new world, my little prophets of doom. The world you predicted. The world you helped create by seeing it before anyone else dared to imagine it. The future belongs to those who saw it coming.